Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, welcome. My name is Danny Harris. I'm so honored to be the Executive Director at Transportation Alternatives, and I'm so honored to welcome you back to Vision Zero Cities. This is a space where, again, this year we will meet virtually, although for those of you in New York, we look forward to meeting many of you on Friday for our in-person events. But this is an opportunity for us to dig in and talk about the experiences that we have all had of trying to implement or advance or even introduce the idea of Vision Zero across our cities. And we're so honored to welcome hundreds of you from around the world and really to learn together. As I'm sure you are seeing in your communities, traffic violence is on the rise. And at the same time, we are seeing some pretty amazing transformations of what's possible on our streets. Obviously, as we look to the future, we need to ensure that our streets continue, that our cities build for people. This is not a new concept, but obviously an old one, and that we need to reprioritize and ensure that our residents, our people, especially those most vulnerable, are at the center of our transportation policy, and that we can come back to the real vision of Vision Zero. In New York City, we are now facing a crisis on our streets. It is now the deadliest year since our mayor took office. And at the same time, we have seen some incredible transformations with open streets and open restaurants and new ways of people getting around. I think the question that we want to explore over the course of these few days together is how we can ensure that many of the innovations that we're seeing in our cities are the ones that win out. Whether we are talking about SUVs or AVs or EVs, in our mind, they're all addressing the same challenge that we're facing on our streets, which is a very limited amount of space that we continue to give away and squander on the movement of vehicles instead of focusing on people. Before we go into our first session, I just want to acknowledge and thank those of you who are in attendance, and also to Vera Mobility, Together for Safer Roads, DoorDash, Line, City Bike by Lyft, Geotag, and the New York League of Conservation Voters. We are just so honored to work in partnership with you. For our first session, we wanted to kick it off with really looking at the possibility of Vision Zero by reimagining space, quite simply, giving more space back to people. And so I'm so honored to welcome for our first panel, my colleague, Jessie Singer, who is the senior strategist and head writer at TA. She's also the author of the forthcoming book, There Are No Accidents, which you can pre-order on Amazon, and I encourage you to do so. Kate Slevin, who is the Executive Vice President of Regional Plan Association, and Ed García Conde, who's the Executive Director at Welcome to the Bronx. As a way of introducing this esteemed panel, I wanted to ask each of them if they could speak a moment or two about how they ended up getting into this work. And then from there, we will talk about 25 by 25 and other plans about taking streets back. But Jessie, can I start it off to you, and then I will turn it over to Kate and Ed.
Absolutely. Thank you, Danny. It's really exciting to be here today. My entry into this work is probably similar to a lot of other people's, which is that I ended up here via a personal loss. I was a young journalist in New York City, and I didn't make a lot of money, so I rode a bike everywhere, and so did everyone else I knew. When a drunk driver killed my best friend on his bike, and as the time passed from that tragedy, the more I looked into it, the more I realized that this wasn't, an accident. It was a known danger. The city knew the street was dangerous. Other people had died there. And via that incredibly preventable tragedy, I came to this work to try and stem the loss that we know is so preventable and so predictable. That's how I end up here, and I've been here ever since.
Do you want me to jump in, Danny?
Yes, please.
Thanks for sharing that, Jessie. I didn't know that history, and appreciate you being open and honest about that with people. So I kind of got into transportation and better transit a little bit by accident. I happened to graduate from graduate school right after 9/11, and it wasn't very easy to find a job in New York City at the time. And I was doing some pretty crappy jobs, including babysitting some not very well-behaved children. And I met with the then director of Transportation Alternatives, and he said, my friend at this organization called Tri-State Transportation Campaign is hiring. you should go talk to him. And I said, transportation, because I had a background in environmental science and environmental policy. But even then, I didn't really make entirely the connection between transportation and climate like we do now. So I went and talked to this person at Tri-State Transportation Campaign, whose name is John Orcutt, who's well known in New York for all of his work over many years. And I ended up getting a job there, and was just the field is just filled with so many wonderful people. And that's a large part of the reason why I've stayed. And it's just transportation and better transit and safe streets. It just connects everything in our life. It connects our society. It connects, climate change and environmental issues, equity issues. So it's been a real joy to be part of this since that time.
Hi, everyone. My name is García, Conde, and I'm a native of the Bronx, the South Bronx in particular. And one of the ways I ended up getting into this line of work and advocacy is through life experiences, particularly the fact that I gave up public transportation and automobiles for biking in the city. And that was about 5 years ago. And one of the first things that I immediately noticed was the inequalities in infrastructure between the core areas of Manhattan and parts of downtown Brooklyn versus my home borough of the Bronx, which is something that's actually nothing new when it comes to how the city has divvied up its infrastructure. We usually don't always get our fair share of what we need. And as a result, tragically, we've actually seen that the most deaths, pedestrian fatalities have been happening in our borough. So this is something that's been really passionate for me to help bring awareness and shine a spotlight on what's going on in the Bronx. How can we get a better, fair access to the infrastructure, to the monies, and just make this is the quality of life issues for so many people on so many levels. And it's not just like fatalities aren't just linked to actual road violence. We have very poor air quality in the South Bronx. People suffer from asthma, 9 times the national rate of asthma. So we have we have an opportunity with this 25 by 25 program to reclaim some of these streets and help probably save lives on so many fronts.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you all. So just as a starting point, Ed, I wanted to start and ask if you could add a little bit more of the local and historical perspective. So obviously, as we're talking about the possibility of what space can mean in a community, you also were starting to talk about what it means when that's squandered. Can you just speak a bit more about the implications of this work and even add a bit of the historical perspective of how a place like the Bronx developed the worst health indicators in all of New York State and even across the nation?
Sure. So basically, in the Bronx, the perfect example is twofold. So it's a borough of dichotomies. The Bronx is the greenest borough with the most open park, most land dedicated to park space. We have a quarter, that's 25% of the land is park space. Now, while that sounds excellent, most of that green space is located in the northern portion of the borough. Whereas the South Bronx and the southern portion of the borough, we don't have as much access to these green spaces. Instead, what we have is a network of highways that ring around the entire South Bronx that literally are choking us, with the fumes and the exhaust that are coming from these trucks. And coupled with Hunts Point, which is the largest food industrial site in the world, not just the country, where you have trucks rolling in and out 24 hours, you have this constant spewing of trucks and of fumes that are literally causing people to, causing a health crisis in our borough. As I mentioned, we have 9 times the national rate of asthma. We have 15 times the hospitalization rate from asthma in New York City. And a lot of this is contributed to the fact that we don't have open spaces where we can actually easily access or are able to enjoy like the rest of the city. We can't access our waterfront as we saw on the tour that we did. And a lot of this is just the design in the Bronx has never been for the people. It's been more for industry and for getting you to point A to point B, and not necessarily through public transportation, but through the comfort of your own vehicle. And which is another irony in the Bronx, because most people don't own a car. And our infrastructure doesn't reflect that. Our infrastructure reflects a society that is not a reality here.
Thanks. And Kate, as the person on this call whose organization has the longest tenure of working on these issues, especially not just in New York, but in the tri-state area, can you give us a little bit of a historical frame about, sort of where we were as a city about spatial allocation and where we're at now?
Sure. I mean, our streets in New York, and I'm sure folks in cities from across the country see the same. There's overrun with cars. And it was not always the case. I mean, it's a result of a number of intentional decisions that were made over time, including the construction of the interstate highway system, which greatly impacted and hurt communities in the Bronx and throughout our city and throughout cities across the country. Basically, we just sort of let car ownership and parking and car usage on the street overwhelm all of our cities. And, especially for old cities like New York, you look at old images, it was not always this way. A century ago, people were in the streets, kids were playing in the streets. It was a very much a people-oriented place. And now you look at the streets and you say, geez, my kid's going to get hit by a car. Or maybe some folks in the call I know have lost people or had people injured. It's a real reality that we face. So, just over time, we've sort of let these decisions, we've let the cars kind of creep into our society. And now, I think many people on the call will agree it's time to kind of creep back and to reclaim that space and say, take more space for the people, take more space for public transit, for cycling, for walking, all these sorts of things. And I speak from an organization that's 100 years old. We were founded and we actually advocated for the construction of many of the highways in New York City because at the time it was a way to improve mobility and improve access and get people out of crowded and congested cities. And it's good to reflect on that history and say, well, it went too far, and it destroyed a number of communities in the 5 boroughs and in our region. And now it's time to be open about that history and chart a new path forward.
And Jessie, you had talked about this notion of helping to subvert a dominant paradigm. So, you've obviously been at the organization now for more years than I have. And you've really sort of been on the front line of this work for a long time. Can you give us a sense of where you see, even with the wins that advocates of having in New York, of where you see that paradigm and if you see it changing?
Well, I think, that dominant paradigm of car culture is especially complicated to change because it's not just New York, right? New York's got a car culture, but America has a car culture, and those things are very inextricable and so cultural. But, obviously we've had a lot of forward momentum in New York. And I think one of the benefits here is that the problem is so much more obvious because New York City can't sprawl. We are a series of limited archipelagos. We are just one archipelago, sorry. And, like that can only go so far. So the spatial inequity is much more obvious here than maybe in a city like LA, where you can, push the limits a lot more and fill in a lot more space with highway. So I think there's a lot of benefit to that. The future, I think, comes with 2 questions that we started with when we started working on NYC 25 by 25. There are 2 problems here. Too many people in New York City own cars and drive cars, and there's too much space devoted to cars. And obviously solving one of those problems works towards the other, which is why we started with the question of what do people need? And we started with 2 ideas. That's how we started to work out the numbers of NYC 25 by 25. And that was that every New Yorker deserves to live within a quarter mile of a car-free protected bus lane and within a quarter mile of a car-free protected bike lane. And that with those options for mobility, we could start to reduce the way that people have a relationship with cars and like reduce that, not just the necessity, but the feeling of necessity. The convenience, but also the feeling of convenience. And I think that kind of starting to create those two parts, that the spatial inequity is unfair and that people need more options. And we have to kind of always link those 2 points of the conversation.
Thanks. So before we dig into some of the more specifics about the various plans, I just wanted to get each of you to say a word about where you think we are in this sort of moment in time, and maybe focus on New York. And you're obviously welcome to expand it out from there, but you know, what you're seeing about car registration, what you're seeing about public transit, what you're seeing about kind of a general appetite for space, traffic violence. So I just, before we dig into where we're headed, I wanted to sort of help, ask each of you to just center us in this moment from where you see New York City on these issues of spatial reclamation. Kate, can I start with you, and then we'll go to Ed and Jessie, please?
Sure. I mean, when I started doing this work, there were no bike lanes, protected bike lanes in New York, really. There was like one bus route that was actually on the street and functioned as a transit way. So there's been a lot of changes in New York that are just tremendous and wonderful over the past 2 decades. I mean, we have bike share. No one ever thought that would ever happen when I started doing this. And you know, the challenge, I think, is that a few years ago we started to see traffic grow to such an extreme, and we haven't really been able to tackle that in a substantial way. And you're seeing it even, you know, after COVID, like the transit use is about 50-60% of pre-COVID levels. Traffic volumes are up over 100% of pre-COVID levels. So while we've seen some real wonderful, incredible changes over the past 20 or so years, and we've seen some very, you know, exciting changes on the streets. I mean, the open streets and open dining programs in New York is one of the most exciting things I've seen happen. We're at kind of an inflection point here, I think, in terms of our streets, the arrival of e-commerce, the growth in traffic, fears about public health, and just transit agencies' budgets. I think all of those are at a moment where we can either kind of chart a path away from, you know, allowing cars to kind of overrun everything, or we can kind of let the status quo continue on. And that's the future I really worry about, because I just, there's no good outcome if you go that path. So that's kind of where I see things.
Thanks, Kate. Ed?
Well, one of the things that I noticed in the first few months of the pandemic was that we had a glimpse into what New York City could look like with open streets. We had, all of a sudden, we reclaimed the streets. We realized and recognized the importance of open spaces. We recognized that, you know, what could, you know, that the street doesn't necessarily have to be just the street dedicated to vehicles. And to me, I think that was one of the most important things that came out of this harsh lesson that we had to learn in New York City. And right now, where we are, it's sort of, you know, we're just trying to figure out our way, you know, like what works. And right now we see that open streets are working. We, you know, where they're being enforced. We see that restaurants and businesses are thriving because of these streets. Pedestrians are moving around. You know, to me, I think it's critical to be able to expand upon and not get rid of this. You know, a lot of people are talking about, well, it's time to get rid of some of the open restaurants, or, you know, get rid of the open streets. To me, that's not the solution. You know, I think we need to implement these things going forward, to make them permanent. It's basically a window into what 25 by 25 could look like.
Thanks, Ed. I totally agree with that. And I think that, like, I think you're right that we've been driven into a more interesting moment by the terrible circumstances of the pandemic. If you look at like the last 10 years, I think of things like the introduction of bike share in New York City and the pedestrianization of Times Square as these sort of paradigm shifting events, changing what your average New Yorker thinks is possible. And I think something that's really interesting right now, and I think we've seen a lot of it with the open streets movement, is that instead of these paradigm shifting events like anyone could rent a public bicycle or you don't need to have cars in Times Square, we're having an argument instead. And I think that's actually really good. Open streets make people angry, and they make the people who live on them and get them invaded by cars, those people are angry, and the car drivers are angry too. And I actually think like that's driving to the forefront a conversation about what we want our streets to be for. Where before, a lot of, everyone on this call probably knows a lot of our issues were much more tangential. A lot of what we're talking about, seemed kooky to people, like, sure, those weird people who ride bikes, or, they want to walk through Times Square, like that was an oddity that people were accepting. We're now, as the movement spreads, we're getting into real conversations and hard conversations about how our streets should function. And I think that that's only going to increase. And the conversations are going to keep being angry, and because people are going to have to change. We're all going to change. And I do think that will be a real challenge. One thing I think that we're not seeing now, which seems like a problem to me, is a lack of boldness from elected officials in that conversation. When I think about, Mayor de Blasio never visiting the crash site of a traffic fatality in New York City. It's a lack of engagement with the problem, and a lack of engagement with the anger that's there about how our streets function and what the actual result of that is. And I think I'm hopeful that, elected officials having the hard conversations about our priorities, how we prioritize our public space, will be something that we have more and more going forward.
Thanks, Jessie. So with that, we've been talking about this idea of 25 by 25, and also mentioned the right-of-way, but RPA and TA have worked together and also independently to advance some pretty big ideas that I would sort of turn it to Kate and to Jessie to share it. But I would also ask, within, as you're sort of giving an outline of your ideas, with the recognition that we have people coming in from all around the country, if you also could share what you're thinking, and also if and how you see it being relevant to those in other communities, especially some of the research and the thinking that went behind it. So Kate, can I turn it to you first to give a window into the right-of-way?
Sure. So what Danny is referring to is a report we put out called The Right-of-Way. Last week, I guess we put it out. It seems like months ago, but it's just last week. And really, this is written by Rob Freudenberg and Ellis Calvin and some of the other really wonderful, intelligent people on RPA's staff. And essentially, it's calling for city leaders and communities to re-envision how we see the streets. We have 32,000 acres of streets in New York City. So how we use them and how we what they're used for is really paramount to how the city functions and thrives. So essentially, we are calling for them to be seen as like a system, a series of systems within a bigger network, a natural system, a transportation system, and a social system. And you use the streets in a way that can accommodate those things. So for example, I mean, we've talked about mobility, and obviously we want the streets to be used more efficiently in terms of how people get around, some more space for biking and walking and buses. But also, we've seen this great growth in social, how we use the street for social networks and social interactions, public plazas, open dining, open streets. So to really enhance that and use them more as a front yard for people than they are now. And then finally, the natural system. And I think this is increasingly a concern for us in New York, and probably for some of you across the country. A lot of our climate change and resilience efforts have been focused on the fact that we have a shoreline, when really what we've seen the past couple of years is that extreme weather and extreme rain events are just as damaging potentially to our region as the seas rising and storms and the impacts of those. So essentially reclaiming any little inch that you can reclaim from pavement and put it back into natural greenery, natural earth, means the city and wherever you live is just more able to absorb the water from those extreme rain events. So essentially, we're calling for this to be looked at holistically. I mean, we're urban planners, so we tend to use wonky words like holistic and trying to get everyone thinking in a bigger way. But I do think all of these things are going to have to be connected more because we have so much pavement in New York. I mean, there's so much pavement in our country, and until we reclaim some of that and think of it in a new way. And certainly if you have parking lots by train stations or parking lots outside the big box store, I mean, that's just all pavement that the water is coming down and just running off of into people's basements and you know, that's not going to be able to continue the way it's been. So that sort of summarizes the right of way. You know, for New York City, some of the recommendations that we put forward were reorienting our transportation department to become Department of Transportation and Public Space. And maybe some of you are already lucky enough to have that in your city. We don't have that yet, so we're hoping to have it one day. And to eventually eliminate all free on-street parking. We have about 3 million parking spaces on the public right-of-way on public streets. And so that's not the most fair or efficient use of that space. And with that, I'll stop.
Thanks, Kate. And if anyone hasn't checked out RPA's right-of-way report, it's really gorgeous and a wonderful read. So you should look it up. NYC 25 by 25 came out almost a year ago now, though it feels like 7 or 8. And what it is a challenge to New York City's next leaders to reclaim 25% of current car space and give it back to people by 25 by 25. And we did a lot of math, like the quarter mile that everyone living within a quarter mile of a protected bike lane or protected bus lane that I talked about earlier, to kind of figure out those numbers. But to kind of explain it for a non-New York necessarily audience, I think there's a few important things that we did in kind of constructing these big ideas. And I want to talk about 2 ways we approached this idea of reclaiming car space. So one is that we talked about who benefits, who's harmed and how, and what we can build. So, you know, often people, you know, the idea of giving up car space is always seen as a loss, even if it's, you know, an exchange. And so we wanted to focus extremely on the potential and the vast potential that we don't often think about because car parking and car traffic is such a dominant paradigm. We're so inured to it. So we did a ton of research on the things that we don't normally think about or don't really pay much attention to. You know, these basic public health problems, labor problems, climate change problems that result from just normal cars constantly everywhere in our lives. And we tried to break that down from every possible angle, looking at, you know, the environmental harms, the public health harms, but also looking at the public health benefits and the economic benefits, and you know, and from many other angles. But from doing it that way, we were able to speak to communities that would benefit. How a parent with young children would benefit from fewer cars. How a late night worker who has to drive a car because they carry heavy equipment, let's say, would benefit from a city with fewer cars. How low-income commuters would benefit, you know, and looked at all the different populations and how the harm of car traffic affects them specifically. And so the other thing we did, I think that might be helpful to other people, is we didn't just imagine we could have all these bus lanes, we could have all these bike lanes, we could have all this new public space, but we also broke down what that would look like in its different forms. So we created 5 street typologies. A school street, a commerce street, an arterial street. Oh no, I'm not going to remember them all. Excuse me. A transit street and a residential street. And looked at those 5 typologies and said, this is what it would look like if we took 25% of the space that's currently given to cars outside your school, on your block, on the street that your bus goes down, and gave it back to people. And I think that functionality really helped people imagine and see all the ways that cars invade every aspect of their lives. You know, we often just focus on our commutes, but it's also your block, and it's also how you drop your kids off, you know? It's also where you do your grocery shopping and what that experience is like crossing the street while carrying a bunch of grocery bags. So I think those different angles really helped broaden the conversation. And let people see that like this affects every New Yorker and every person in this country, you know, but especially for city dwellers to see how this invades every aspect of your lives and how there's so much potential in so many different directions.
Thank you, Jessie and Kate. Ed, I wanted to turn to you also with your journalist hat on, but you know, can you give a sense too about you know, how you translate these ideas or how you convince a public around some of these, and you know, how are you connecting this to people across different neighborhoods, different languages, elected officials, but can you kind of give us a sense of how you think about translating these big ideas at a hyperlocal level?
That's actually the biggest challenge that we have, is translating all of this language, all of this lingo, all of these policies into what someone on a local level is going to understand. And one of the things that I've noticed throughout my lifetime in the Bronx is activists and organizers who live in the borough, they pretty much know their communities where they're embedded in. And a lot of people might think of what an organizer is, might be someone who's actively, actively recruiting people to a cause or whatnot, but it's not just individuals. Local organizations serve as organizers that are grassroots within the neighborhood, and these people know their community better than anybody. So I think one of the biggest challenges that communities and cities across the country have is identifying who are these key organizations in the impacted communities, and how can you work with them to get this messaging across to them, which in turn translates back to the local elected official. To me, that's always been the biggest challenge in the Bronx, is identifying the key partners, and it's also the most important, because if you don't have the constituents on your side, how are we going to get these issues to move forward?
So building on that, and this is a question for all of you, is, you've all talked about obviously the longstanding racial and environmental inequities that are, that have been built into the city. So this is a new idea, or these are new ideas. There's one piece about acknowledging the past, and there's the other about charting a different pathway moving forward. So I'm curious if you could speak about kind of how you see the process or implementation, hopefully playing out in a different way, and what your perspective is on that. So Jessie, can I start with you, and then we'll go to Kate and Ed?
I mean, I think, I'm not going to attempt to solve the community board problem here in this space, but I think that something that is happening now that maybe wasn't happening 10 years ago in this space is not just like acknowledging the massive historically racist planning decisions that led to these inequities and continue today and continue to perpetrate these inequities. As Ed was saying, like there's like 1/8 of a mile of protected bike lanes in the Bronx. Check that number before you quote me, but fewer than any in the city, despite having a higher number of cyclist fatalities year after year after year. So it's not like this is just a historic problem. But I do think that one thing that's changing in an interesting way is that we are talking about the need to let communities lead, to listen to communities, to give communities, agency and knowing what's needed most. But also, as we have a conversation about reducing car use, we're constantly having a conversation. I think this is the most important thing about the fact that like people aren't driving cars in many cases because they want to, because they feel they need to, because they don't have other options, because the bus is incredibly slow and non-functional, even if in places like the Bronx, it is the main form of public transportation. So I do think that like that is a way forward. And like a lot of what Ed was talking about with working with organizers and working with activists and working with people who are already doing the work on the ground, I think is key moving forward. And I think a lot of what we tried to do with 25 by 25 is connecting those dots, because, transportation is an issue for public health providers. Transportation is an issue for labor organizers. Like there isn't a facet of progressive community activism in New York City that isn't touched by transportation, that isn't made less fair by our unfair transportation policies. So I think connecting those dots is the most important work we can do. And I appreciated, Kate, the way you talked about like RPA's history, because I also think that like critical to that work is that we are acknowledging all the ways we've screwed it up in the past. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the urban planning profession has a lot of soul searching that it's started to do and will continue to do. It's, and it's in terms of, historical disparity and equity and racism. I mean, it's not just transportation, it's planning, it's generally housing policy, environmental justice issues. I mean, it runs throughout all of urban planning's profession. But I don't know the answer to your question entirely, Danny, but I know there's some good examples out there that we can point to and that we have used in our work to kind of give us inspiration. One is Oakland, and I don't know if there's anyone from Oakland on the call. Shout out to Oakland if there are, but they have started to do a lot of budgeting based on equity issues. So like they'll fill potholes in lower income neighborhoods before they fill potholes in higher wealth neighborhoods. They have actually worked with community-based organizations, having the city actually directly engage with and pay community-based organizations to do public engagement for them, rather than hiring, a consultant that sort of doesn't know the community as well. So that one always sticks in my mind as a good way to start doing things differently and get equity in at the beginning rather than trying to sort of fix it later on and bring it in later on. I do think generally, public engagement has a lot of issues traditionally because you tend to get people who have the time and resources to be able to be in meetings and to spend the time. So, addressing that is I think really important if you're actually going to get a bigger swath of people engaged. And, the community board system in New York is also often pointed to as a model for public engagement. When you actually live in New York and see how it functions and you see who's on the community board and how it's not actually representative of the neighborhood always, you can see the challenges there, even if you do have an engaged like a strategy for public engagement that's sort of built into the civic fabric of how your government functions. So with that, I'll stop there. I think there's a lot of other case studies that we're starting to see, but really cities across the country are looking at this and putting out some new ideas. And I'd be interested in the chat if folks have examples they want to share, because I'm always looking for new ideas and new case studies to cite.
Forgive me for hopping in early, Ed, but Kate, I wanted to share with you and everyone an article. I'll put it in the chat from the new issue of the Vision Zero Cities Journal, which was written by Adil Ortiz, who's with Spirit House in, I think, Durham, North Carolina, definitely in North Carolina. But it was an interesting story because, like many cities, the city looked to roll out open streets in her community at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and there was pushback, and Adil helped facilitate a process that actually talked about what the community needed, and what the community needed was safety infrastructure that they had been asking for years and had been disregarded, and were rightfully offended that now the city wanted to come and shut down their street and make pedestrian space, which wasn't their priority. So I'll post that in the chat. It's a longer story, but it's a really nice example of an actual community conversation and progress. And it should have happened long before that moment, but also it's a good model. Sorry for interrupting, Ed.
No, it's that was perfect actually, because it illustrates exactly what happens in New York City, and especially in places like the Bronx. We have all the people making the policies and making the changes in all levels of government. And sometimes they claim that they're having community conversations, but the community is often wondering, well, I was never notified of this, or I don't know when, when you guys had this alleged meeting. And I think that's the most important thing too. Speak with the actual community, find out what the community needs and wants, and work it from there before making all these top-down decisions, which is what's always been happening, especially in the Bronx. For some reason, in communities of color and low-income communities, it's almost as if they feel like they know better for what, better for, what's better for us. And clearly, the health disparities that we've had for the last half a century indicate otherwise. It indicates that they don't know better. So I think it's extremely critical to actually engage with your community before making top-down decisions, and have them in not just the decision-making process, but the learning process, because there are things that you're going to learn from the community as someone who might be making these decisions. And at the same time, it's a two-way street. The community is going to be learning about alternatives that are available to them. So they might have one way of thinking, for example, we've been talking about what a street should look like. But without that education and presentation of, what it could be, that's where you have to make these necessary linkages. But again, always involve your communities in these decisions. People love coming to these meetings, contrary to popular belief. And also, while I'm speaking of meetings, make those meetings accessible. Don't make those meetings when people cannot be there. And that is why you don't have people attending. That's why, DOT will look like, well, we only have 5 people show up. Well, why did you have 5 people show up? Did you schedule that in-person meeting at 5:30 p.m. in the middle of the week when parents are still trying to get their kids from school, or whatnot? You have to be realistic when that meeting is being held. We've had meetings in the Bronx for extremely important decisions for the community that were being made also like at 1 p.m. Public meetings. Who is available to go to this public meeting at 1 o'clock, if it's in person? So I think a lot of the city planners and decision makers have to really make an effort to make these meetings accessible. And we've seen that through Zoom and online meetings, that has been key to participation. We've had participation in meetings, in the hundreds for some meetings where we would maybe get a dozen. So accessibility is the key for these things.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I do think it helps if you have a bigger vision in mind, like, okay, here's the broad plan. We have to add 200 miles of protected cycling lanes, right? So you as a community, we're going to come together and talk about how it's going to go through your neighborhood. But absent that big vision and those big plans and the big mandate, that's kind of the overarching strategy. It's very hard for a specific community to understand how they fit in. And this goes not just for transportation issues, but also for housing policy. I know the city of Chicago is advancing a comprehensive planning effort, which I think is like a nice frame for a lot of this stuff we're talking about here when it comes to reprioritizing streets or making communities better, more equitable, more balanced. I think there's a lot to be said for approach like that, because people can have those conversations, Ed, that you're talking about ahead of time. And so their visions are on the table. They understand, how they can interact with the city's larger framework or larger development proposal. And it's not just a piecemeal thing where you have 1 mile of bike lane or 1 mile of bus lane, and then the next neighborhood, there's nothing being built there. So I do think that can help.
Thanks. So let me open it up for questions. There's a really sort of spirited debate going on in the chat. So first of all, thank you everybody for introducing yourself and putting ideas in this space. Per Kate's ask, if there are other case studies or things that are relevant to you, please do share them in the chat. And we'll turn to the Q&A. And I'm just we'll sort of start with, there are 2 New York City specific questions, but I'm actually going to start with, there's a question from Eris Weaver. So he is sort of reflecting on some of the New York City specific things like 25 by 25. And it says, it seems more doable in a densely populated city. I'm an activist in a rural suburban county. The largest city population density is 15% of New York City. How might some of these ideas be adapted for application in other areas? So Kate or Jessie, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're a regional organization, so we cover the entire New York City metro area, including some very suburban and some even rural areas. I mean, the great thing about not being in a city like New York is you have more space. You have more space on your streets and less competition for space. I think, you know, that there are some benefits to that, especially if you want more space dedicated for cycling. You know, maybe it's easier to get around there by bike than say it would be by bus, which might be harder to support that kind of land use. So that, I mean, I don't know that I have any necessary suggestions for it, but we know it is possible to make this shift. And, you know, you see cities all over the world that are relatively lower density doing it quite well. And in fact, in a suburban environment, it can actually work really well, especially for kids who need to get around and have no other means to get around other than their parents' or car if they're able to own one. So I do think there's, if you sort of look at the space and how the space is allocated and start taking a little bit of space here and there for, say, cycling or walking or whatever, it's a big, it could really help.
Thanks, Eris. Just to add a little to what Kate was saying, I think, you know, when we talk about spatial equity, you know, 25 by 25 were numbers we came up with for New York City. But I think a way we looked at it that could be applicable even in the suburbs is about what your community's priorities are. You know, are they reducing traffic violence? Are they improving public health? Are they fighting climate change? And then using those priorities to target different types of street space. You know, like when we looked at 25 by 25 on a city level, on a neighborhood level, and on a street level, and taking this 25% kind of in each of those different lenses. And so like from a suburban perspective, you could look at that same conversation of, you know, like a residential cul-de-sac, a residential housing development, and then a commercial, you know, downtown area. And by isolating it to those conversations and not necessarily the highways in between, you can, you know, look to take space back from cars and have those spaces meet the priorities of your communities in a finite way that does work within the spatial allocation paradigm, but doesn't necessarily get into the complicated nature of like highway land use in between those spaces in more suburban areas.
Thank you. And Eris, my sincere apologies, and thank you for the clarification. Let's turn to, there's a question. It says, thank you, New York City advocates and staff, for leading the way. To Jessie's point of a vision to have residents within a quarter mile of a dedicated busway or bikeway, has the transportation department incorporated this into their performance measures? And so I might ask if Jessie and Kate could give a window of if it doesn't exist, of how you think it, you know, metrics might be approached differently based on the visions that you're moving forward with 25 by 25 and right of way. So Jessie, let me turn this one to you.
So in direct answer to your question, no, not yet. But looking towards the future, I think something that we are pushing for and that we're hopeful for is, you know, based on this idea that you can't change what you don't track. And there's so much in New York City that we don't track relative to how cars affect our lives. So something that Transportation Alternatives called for in our recent Open Streets report, and that the Democratic mayoral candidate Eric Adams, you know, wholeheartedly seemed to support, was this idea of an audit that looks at traffic related harms and how they fall differently around our city. So starting to measure things, not just traffic violence, but asthma rates and asthma hospitalizations, planning dollars as they're spent by neighborhood. And so all these different metrics that can kind of, and you know, how long does a person have to walk to get to a protected bus lane? How inaccessible is that for them, or how accessible is that? And how does that track with all these other metrics and all these other harms related to traffic? So I'm hopeful, you know, for a better set of metrics moving forward that all the more prove our point and force us to move towards a better future as a result.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I mean, that we did get legislation passed a couple years ago in New York City called Streets Master Plan, and essentially the DOT is mandated to create a master plan for city streets. The first one's actually due in December, and I know they're doing outreach about that right now. But the legislation had some pretty clear benchmarks, 150 miles of dedicated bus lanes over 5 years, 250 miles of protected bike lanes over 5 years, among a variety of other mandates in the legislation. So I feel like that's like a good frame to hang some of this stuff on, and to sort of, ensure that at least that is being met, and we can push to be more ambitious, once we have a new mayor in office come January. So there are some things I think that are kind of making a difference and moving towards that.
Thanks. Ed, I'm going to turn this one to you. Hank asks, how hopeful are you about Eric Adams, who's the current borough president, who's running for mayor, about the sort of the dedication of him towards Vision Zero and growing open streets? And maybe if I can just ask more broadly also, because this is to a broader audience, can you maybe give a sense of how you, with the promises that are coming, especially with the new candidate, of, how you think about them in relation to sort of the expectation versus the reality of implementation over time?
Well, in New York City yesterday, we all were pretty excited when we read that Eric Adams was promising 300 miles of protected bike lanes, backing 25 by 25. I mean, these are huge, huge, huge things. For me as an individual and as a resident of New York City, especially in the Bronx, am I hopeful? Cautiously optimistic is probably better, because sadly we've seen so many campaign promises made and never fully executed. But I am hopeful that he is seeing the extreme need for these measures to actually happen. I'm hopeful that a lot of the fatalities that we've had, especially this year, are not in vain. Or any of those, or any of the people impacted by traffic violence haven't been in vain, and that we have someone in City Hall, in Gracie Mansion, that is going to do the right thing by the people, by everyone. Because this isn't just, it's not just for the pedestrians who are being impacted. It's all, it's also for the drivers, whether they realize it or not themselves. So I am a little optimistic in this case, just cautiously so, though.
Thank you. So there's one last question that we'll take from Trisha Sharma, and the question is, any thoughts on racial disparities in access to public green space? This is obviously a big question that we could have go on for no shortage of amount of time, but just to be aware of the time, I wanted to ask if maybe one or two voices want to speak into this, and then I'll give each of you a last word as we close up. Would anybody like to step in and address this question?
I mean, I think that's why the streets are so important in how they're used. I mean, it's been well documented. Like the Nature Conservancy published a report with a few other organizations that found lower levels of tree canopy in neighborhoods with lower access to wealth, and neighborhoods with higher proportion of people of color. So like it's well documented, and there's streets everywhere. And so that's a great vehicle to try and address that and bring the natural system to the people, rather than making the people go to the natural system that might be far from their house.
I absolutely seconding what Kate's saying, and I think the most important part of this conversation is not just what we can use our streets for, but like what results from that. I think we often think about parkland as an amenity, but when we talk about things like the canopy, we're talking about racial inequities and overheating deaths in the summer. When we talk about access to green space, we're talking about different cognitive outcomes, because higher car pollution levels near your kid's school means lower test scores for those kids. So there's just, I think taking this idea of green space and reclaiming traffic space out of the idea of recreation and into the realm of public health is a really important part of this conversation, because it directly connects the incredibly inequitable outcomes we have in public health and those incredible racial disparities to how we use our space.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything that everyone has said, both Kate and Jessie there. The South Bronx is a living example of racial disparities in access to public green spaces. We have historically been cut off from our waterfront. We have been historically cut off from any green spaces in the South Bronx. And it's the ultimate irony, as I mentioned earlier, that the Bronx has the largest portion of their land dedicated to these green spaces. And yet in the South Bronx, that's not the case. And as we've mentioned before ad nauseum, it's led to so many the health disparities. The Bronx has the highest rates of diabetes in the state. We have the highest rates of asthma in the state. We have the highest rates of obesity. And all of these are along racial disparities and access to green spaces, because we know when we have access to green spaces, it's also access to health, to our health. It's access to mental health, not just physical health and overall wellness. And a lot of this has been by design. We've been fighting for access to a waterfront in the South Bronx, but we're finally starting to get access to the waterfront because about 4,000 units of luxury housing is being constructed, which is not for us. We already know we're not going to be the ones that are moving into these new buildings. Yet here we are all of a sudden getting a sliver of the waterfront. So yes, there are major, the two are connected. It's without a doubt. Just take a look at the South Bronx. You can Google it and you'll see a wealth of data on just that.
Thank you. So in closing, I wanted to give each of you a last word, and if there's something that you wanted to add in, maybe something that you're hopeful for, especially as we look to the next year. But I just wanted to give each of you a minute if you want to say something else before we close the session. Kate, you want to kick us off?
I'll say something. I get really frustrated by the us versus them dynamic when it comes to some of these topics. Like, we often, will say, oh, car owners and cars, and it's not really like, a lot of people actually own a car and they bike and they take transit and they walk. So it's not really the way to approach it. I think it's a bigger issue. It's a collective problem. It's a collective problem of climate change, a collective problem of public safety, and a collective problem of improving the lives for our kids. And so that's the way I think it's a better frame for us to understand this stuff, and not get into the like, oh, car driver, bad, bike cyclist, good, because it's not that simple. Like anything in life, it's not that simple. And so I think those dynamics can hurt us actually, than rather move us forward to have more productive conversations and come together to make things better.
One thing I wanted to share in closing is, our city, like many of your cities, had initiated an open streets program in the last in the last 2 years. And TA recently undertook a massive surveying effort of ours. And while there was a lot of data that came from that, we also asked for anecdotes. We asked people to give us, their impressions. And it was the most striking part of the report. People talked about living on a street for 50 years and never noticing the details of the architecture on the building across the street because they never stood in the right perspective before, because there are always cars there. A person who was low vision talked about being able to feel safe for the first time walking on the street or the sidewalk. A woman described her relationship with her mother being transformed, her mother who was in a wheelchair, because attending the open street and just being able to stroll in public and see the beauty and complications of the city around them in safety and comfort gave them both some space to connect. And so I think that's the thing I want you to leave with, is that cars are the dominant paradigm, but people don't know what they could have instead. All of those are stories of people who didn't know they were missing something, and that the cars were taking something away. And when we closed the street, we opened a world of vision and possibility and potential. And I think there's a lot of hope in that, that we can show people the way, and really change lives.
For me, what I would like for people to, take away from this is, one of the things that I've noticed with open streets in New York City, in the nation's most populous city and largest city, is that for the first time in my life, I was able to walk around the streets of New York in these open streets, and I was able to breathe and smell different smells that weren't contaminated with just exhaust from buses or trucks or whatnot, I was able to smell, just smell. And for someone who doesn't have upper respiratory problems or anything like that, I thought that that was brilliant. And then it took me like a few seconds to make that connection. I can only imagine what people with upper respiratory issues, whether it be asthma or whatnot, felt when they can actually step out into the streets and not be bombarded with all these toxins. I mean, it was actually recorded. If you go back, and to the New York Times and the Washington Post reported the reduction in these fumes in New York City and major cities like New York. I just want you to think about like the impact like that can have on someone's life, that they can reclaim their lungs as well. It's not just their space, but their lungs. That's how we live.
Thank you. I'm just personally, I'm so grateful for your time, and I'm so grateful to count all of you as colleagues in this work in this city, and also in pushing this work across the nation. So thank you to everybody for joining us. In 15 minutes, I hope you'll join us for the first decade of Vision Zero. And then at 5:45 Eastern Time, we have our keynote, Charles T. Brown. So please join us for the day. We look forward to continuing the conversation, and I wish you a good afternoon. Thank you, everybody. And thank you again, Jessie and Kate and Ed. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.